They told you the world was stabilizing. They told you the worst was behind us. They told you diplomacy was working, that sanctions were squeezing, that the pressure was mounting, and soon, inevitably, Iran would blink. But what if they were wrong? What if, while everyone was watching the headlines, something far more seismic was quietly assembling itself beneath the surface of the global order? Something that didn't just challenge American power, but was designed to permanently dismantle it? Because here is the truth that no mainstream anchor will say out loud. The death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei did not weaken Iran. It lit a fuse, and Russia and China were already standing by with the match. Let's start with what actually happened, because the official narrative is sanitized to the point of being unrecognizable. When Khamenei passed, the Western world exhaled. There was a collective, almost embarrassing sigh of relief in corridors from Washington to Brussels. Analysts rushed to their cameras, pundits filled their columns, and the dominant message was clear. This was an opportunity, a moment of Iranian vulnerability, a chance for moderates to rise, for the clerical establishment to fracture, for the regime to soften or even collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions. That was the story being told, and it was wrong on every single count. What Western observers consistently fail to understand about Iran, what they have failed to understand for over 4 decades, is that the Islamic Republic was never built around one man. It was built around a system, a theology of governance so deeply embedded into the institutional structure of the state that it functions even in the absence of its most visible symbol. The supreme leader is not a president. He is not an emperor. He is the doctrinal anchor of a revolutionary ideology that has survived war, assassinations, crippling sanctions, cyber attacks, mass protests, and the constant psychological pressure of being surrounded by adversaries. Khamenei's passing did not create a power vacuum. It created a power succession, and the successor was chosen before the body was cold. But the succession itself is almost secondary to what happened on the international stage in the hours, days, and weeks that followed. Because while Washington was busy running geopolitical calculations about Iranian internal politics, Moscow and Beijing were making moves, not subtle moves, not diplomatic whispers, moves of extraordinary boldness, the kind that signal not just sympathy but strategic alignment so deep it has now become structural. Vladimir Putin's response to Khamenei's death was not merely a condolence message, it was a declaration. The language he used, the imagery his state media deployed, the personal warmth with which he spoke of the supreme leader as a man of history, a defender of sovereignty, a leader who understood what it meant to stand against empire. This was not the language of a neutral observer paying respects. This was the language of an ally eulogizing a comrade in arms. Putin mourned Khamenei the way a general mourns the loss of a brother officer, and that distinction matters enormously. Russia and Iran have been deepening their relationship for years, but there is a tendency in the West to treat this partnership as transactional, a marriage of convenience between two isolated states forced together by mutual sanctioning. That framing is dangerously naive. What has developed between Moscow and Tehran is a genuine strategic convergence rooted in a shared worldview. Both states believe the unipolar American-led order is illegitimate. Both believe that Western liberalism is a civilizational weapon wielded to destabilize non-compliant governments. Both have concluded, not theoretically but operationally, that the only way to survive and ultimately prevail against American power is through active coordination, mutual defense, and the construction of alternative systems of trade, finance, and military cooperation. The evidence of this is not speculative. Iran provided Russia with Shahed drones that were used extensively across the Ukrainian battlefield. Russia provided Iran with advanced air defense technology, satellite intelligence sharing, and diplomatic cover at the United Nations. The two countries have been conducting joint naval exercises in the Caspian and beyond. They have aligned their oil pricing strategies to blunt the impact of Western sanctions. They have created bilateral trade corridors that circumvent the dollar-based financial system entirely. These are not the actions of two countries reluctantly cooperating. These are the actions of two countries building a long-term alliance architecture designed to outlast any single leader, any single war, and any single administration in Washington. And then there is China. Beijing's response to the situation in Iran was more measured in tone, as it always is, because China's strategic culture prizes patience over provocation. But make no mistake, the substance of China's position was no less consequential than Russia's. Beijing has been Iran's single largest trading partner for years. The two countries signed a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement that spans energy, infrastructure, military technology, and intelligence sharing. China does not make that kind of commitment lightly. That agreement is not a diplomatic gesture. It is a $40 billion annual investment in Iran's strategic survival, and it sends one unmistakable message to Washington: Iran is not yours to collapse. When China announced that it stood firmly for Iran's right to security and sovereignty following Khamenei's death, when its foreign ministry spokespersons began framing any American military posturing in the Persian Gulf as destabilizing provocation, the White House found itself in a position it deeply dislikes, having to choose between escalation and retreat in a theater where the cost of escalation has suddenly become catastrophically high. Because this is the new math of American power, and it is a math Washington has been struggling to solve for nearly a decade. In the era of unipolarity, the United States could threaten, sanction, isolate, or strike almost any state in the world without serious risk of great power retaliation. Those days are over. Today, any military action against Iran does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a world where Russia has the most advanced air defense systems on the planet and has demonstrated a willingness to absorb Western pressure without flinching. It occurs in a world where China has the second largest defense budget on Earth and has made clear that the destabilization of a major partner on its strategic periphery is a red line. It occurs in a world where Iran itself, weakened in the Western imagination but far more capable than its adversaries prefer to acknowledge, has built a web of proxy forces, missile arsenals, and asymmetric capabilities that can reach from the Red Sea to the Strait of Hormuz to the Eastern Mediterranean. The question is no longer whether Iran can be destroyed. The question is what the cost of attempting to destroy it has become. And that cost, in the current configuration, is potentially catastrophic on a scale no American president wants to hand their successor. Iran's response to all of this was not the response of a country in mourning paralysis. It was the response of a country that had prepared for this moment. The new leadership moved quickly, not chaotically, but with the confident deliberateness of an institution that has been stress-tested across decades of existential crisis. They consolidated the clerical council. They reinforced the Revolutionary Guard's command structure. They issued statements calibrated to project strength without providing a casus belli. And simultaneously, they conducted what can only be described as a strategic signaling campaign directed not at Washington, but at Washington's partners in the region. Messages were sent to Gulf states that had been quietly normalizing relations with Israel. Reminders were delivered to governments that had been allowing American military infrastructure to operate from their soil. These were not threats of immediate violence. They were something more sophisticated and more destabilizing. They were reminders of the new geometry of power in the region. Reminders that the Abraham Accords, for all their fanfare, had not created a security architecture capable of containing a determined and alliance-backed Iran. Reminders that the American security umbrella, already showing stress fractures from a decade of strategic overextension, was not the absolute guarantee it once was. The American response to all of this was, frankly, muddled. There were carrier group deployments, the traditional American signal of displeasure and intent. There were statements from the State Department about the importance of stability and the unacceptability of Iranian regional aggression. There were consultations with European allies who listened politely and privately questioned whether this was the right moment to be rattling sabers against a state that China had just publicly committed to protect. There were congressional hearings in which officials struggled to articulate a coherent Iran strategy that accounted for the new Russia-China-Iran alignment because the honest answer, that no such coherent strategy currently exists, was politically impossible to say aloud. And while all of this was unfolding in the diplomatic sphere, something was happening on the ground in the region that nobody in the Western press seemed to notice adequately. Iran's strike capabilities were not degrading. They were advancing. The precision of their ballistic missile program had improved significantly. Their drone technology, much of it developed domestically, some of it informed by battlefield learning through the transfer of knowledge with Russia, had reached a level of sophistication that Israeli air defense planners have described in private briefings as genuinely concerning. Their network of affiliated forces in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Gaza remained battered in places, degraded in others, but structurally intact and ideologically motivated in ways that pure military force has consistently failed to extinguish. The picture that emerges when you step back and look at it honestly is not a picture of American dominance managing a fractious but ultimately controllable Middle East. It is the picture of a new axis of resistance that is better resourced, better coordinated, more diplomatically protected, and more strategically confident than at any previous moment in its existence. And at the center of that axis, in the aftermath of Khamenei's death, stands a new Iranian leadership that knows it has the backing of the two most powerful military forces on Earth and is prepared to act accordingly. Part 2, 2,200 words. If Part 1 was the architecture of the alliance, Part 2 is the earthquake it has produced. Because Iran strikes back, and the world is watching whether the rules that governed the last 50 years of Middle Eastern geopolitics still apply. The first thing you need to understand about Iran's response to American pressure following the transition of leadership is that it was not improvised. Nothing about Iran's strategic doctrine is improvised. The Islamic Republic has had decades to study American military psychology, to map American political constraints, to calculate where the red lines are, and, crucially, to identify where American resolve runs thin. And what they have concluded based on that study is that America's greatest vulnerability is not military. It is political. It is the deep structural reluctance of the American public to absorb the costs of another open-ended war in the Middle East, particularly a war against a state that is geographically 3 times the size of Iraq, militarily far more capable, and now diplomatically shielded by Beijing and Moscow. Iran's strikes, therefore, were engineered not to trigger a war, but to demonstrate capacity without providing Washington with a clean political justification for full-scale retaliation. This is asymmetric deterrence at its most sophisticated. It is the strategic lesson of Hezbollah refined and elevated to state doctrine. You do not need to defeat the United States militarily. You need to make the price of confrontation high enough and the benefits of restraint compelling enough that the American political system talks itself out of escalation. And in the current environment, fractured domestic politics, an exhausted military-industrial complex, a European alliance that is visibly reluctant, that calculation may finally be working. The strikes themselves targeted American military assets and regional partner infrastructure with a precision that sent a very deliberate message. The message was not chaos. The message was control. Iran was demonstrating that it knew exactly where American forces were positioned, exactly which facilities mattered most to American operational capability, and exactly how to reach them, while staying just below the threshold that would compel a response of overwhelming force. Whether you call this brilliance or recklessness depends on your vantage point, but you cannot call it impulsive. This was a choreographed demonstration of capability, executed by people who have been planning it for years. Washington's dilemma in responding to these strikes was enormous and deeply revealing of the broader strategic crisis. A proportional military response risked triggering the very escalation spiral that China and Russia were waiting to exploit. A disproportionate response risked the same, plus the diplomatic catastrophe of destroying the fragile multilateral framework that the United States relies upon to maintain its coalition politics. No response, or an insufficient one, risked the credibility collapse that American strategists fear more than almost anything else, because the entire architecture of deterrence rests on the belief that American red lines are real. Pull back visibly enough and that architecture begins to crack everywhere simultaneously, not just in the Middle East, but in East Asia and Eastern Europe, everywhere that American security guarantees serve as the load-bearing wall of an ally's defense calculus. This is the trap that Russia and China have been constructing patiently and methodically for the better part of a decade. It is not a single trap. It is a system of interlocking pressure points designed to force the United States into a choice between 2 forms of strategic defeat: overextension or retreat. Overextend in too many theaters simultaneously, and the military, the economy, and the political will of the American public fracture under the weight. Retreat from confrontation, and the credibility that holds together the entire alliance network begins to erode. There is no clean path through this dilemma. There is only the management of competing bad options, and that management requires a clarity of strategic vision and a unity of political will that the United States is currently not demonstrating. Putin watched all of this unfold with what can only be described as a grim, calculated satisfaction. Not because Russia wants war. War is expensive, unpredictable, and has already consumed enormous Russian resources in Ukraine. But because every hour that American attention, resources, and political energy are consumed by the Iran crisis is an hour that benefits Russia's position in Europe. Every piece of military hardware diverted to the Persian Gulf theater is a piece that is not flowing to Ukrainian forces. Every diplomatic conversation focused on Tehran is a conversation not focused on Moscow. The multiplication of American strategic burdens is itself a form of Russian victory, achieved without a single Russian soldier firing a single shot at an American target. China's calculus is different but equally clear. Beijing does not want instability in the Gulf. China imports too much oil from the region to welcome chaos in the Strait of Hormuz. But China does want the demonstration visible to the entire global South that American military hegemony is not inevitable, that resistance is viable, and that alignment with the China-Russia-Iran axis provides a genuine strategic alternative to subordination within the American-led order. Every time Iran absorbs American pressure and survives, every time the United States discovers that the costs of confrontation exceed what the political system will bear, China's argument to wavering states across Africa, Asia, and Latin America becomes more compelling. You do not have to choose the American camp. There is another camp. It is imperfect, it is authoritarian in many of its members, but it is resilient, it is resource-rich, and it is no longer weak. This is the battle that is actually being fought. Not just in the skies over the Persian Gulf, not just in the corridors of the United Nations, but in the minds of every government on Earth that is watching this confrontation and drawing conclusions about which way the global wind is blowing. And right now, whatever the final outcome of any specific military exchange, the narrative momentum belongs to the Axis and not to Washington. The human dimension of all of this must not be forgotten in the abstraction of grand strategy, because ultimately, it is human beings who pay the price for these geopolitical contests. The Iranian people, who have endured decades of sanctions that have systematically degraded their standard of living, their access to medicine, their economic prospects, their ability to simply live normal lives. These are not abstract variables in a strategic equation. They are people caught between an authoritarian government that uses their suffering as a nationalist rallying cry and a foreign power whose stated goal of changing that government has produced, in practice, nothing except more suffering for the very population it claims to want to liberate. The sanctions regime, for all its proponents' confidence, has failed in its fundamental objective. Iran is not more compliant, it is more defiant. Its government is not weaker, its alliance network is stronger. The only thing the sanctions have reliably accomplished is the pauperization of ordinary Iranians and the consolidation of hardline power within the revolutionary establishment. Meanwhile, the regional architecture that American diplomacy spent decades constructing is under genuine stress. The Abraham Accords, once celebrated as a historic breakthrough, are being tested by the reality that paper normalization between Arab governments and Israel does not translate into genuine strategic alignment when Iranian pressure mounts. Gulf states that quietly celebrated American strength are quietly recalibrating their insurance policies, exploring what accommodation with Tehran might look like in a world where American guarantees feel less absolute. Saudi Arabia famously has already restored diplomatic relations with Iran under Chinese mediation, a diplomatic coup that Beijing leveraged not through military power but through the simple, devastating demonstration that it could deliver outcomes that Washington could not. And Israel, the wild card that haunts every calculation in this region, is navigating a threat landscape of extraordinary complexity. The IDF is a formidable military force, but it is a force with geographical limitations, political constraints, and strategic vulnerabilities that have never been more visible. The capacity to conduct a decisive strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, assuming the political authorization, requires American logistical and intelligence support that Washington may not be prepared to extend in the current environment. And the consequences of such a strike in a world where Iran has Russian air defense systems and Chinese diplomatic protection and proxy forces capable of opening multiple simultaneous fronts are genuinely incalculable in ways they simply were not a decade ago. The world that is emerging from all of this is not the world that Western strategists designed or intended. It is not a world of converging liberal democracies gradually extending the rules-based order to every corner of the globe. It is a world of competing blocs, hardening alignments, and a multipolar distribution of power that is messier, more dangerous, and fundamentally less governable than the brief American moment that followed the Cold War. Within that world, Iran has positioned itself through cunning, through suffering, through strategic patience, and through the construction of relationships that took years to build, as a pivotal state whose fate will help determine the shape of what comes next. The question that every honest observer must now confront is whether the United States has the strategic wisdom, the domestic political coherence, and the international coalition building capability to navigate this new reality, or whether it will continue to apply the tools of unipolarity to a multipolar world and wonder why they keep breaking in its hands. Putin will not stop watching, Beijing will not stop calculating, Tehran will not stop maneuvering, and the axis that has assembled itself around the shared conviction that American power can be challenged, exhausted, and ultimately redirected, that axis is not going away. It is not a temporary coalition of convenience. It is a structural feature of the new geopolitical landscape, and understanding it, not dismissing it, not demonizing it into caricature, but genuinely understanding how it was built, what drives it, and what it wants, is the only starting point for any strategy that could realistically contain it. The world did not change the day Khamenei died. The world had already changed. That day just made it impossible to pretend otherwise. The alliance is real, the challenge is real, and the question of how the West responds to it, with clarity or confusion, with wisdom or with the blind inertia of a fading hegemony, may well be the defining question of the next quarter century. Stay awake, because the next chapter of this story has already begun.